The block party was supposed to be a fresh start for Danny and me. Moving to this neighborhood felt like hitting reset. New faces, a safe place for my son to play, and a chance to leave the past behind. I'd heard about the block party from Linda, the cheerful neighbor who lived 2 houses over. "You have to come," she'd said. "It's tradition, everyone shows up." When the day came, it was everything you'd expect. Colorful decorations hung from every porch. Grills smoked with burgers and hot dogs. Kids dashed through sprinklers while the adults laughed over folding tables piled with food. It felt perfect, almost too perfect, like a postcard. And yet, even before he arrived, I felt something I couldn't explain. A heaviness in the air, a sense that something was off. That was when he appeared. He came from nowhere, stepping into the crowd as if he'd always been part of it. A man in his 30s, clean-shaven, with sharp features and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Chris," he said, shaking hands and blending in seamlessly. But when I looked closer, something about him felt wrong. I didn't know it yet, but this was the beginning of a nightmare. At first, Chris was just another face in the crowd. He moved easily from group to group, making small talk and laughing at jokes like he belonged. No one questioned him, not even me. But the longer I watched, the stranger he seemed. He asked questions, not the usual ones about work or family, but things that felt oddly personal. "Do you lock your doors at night?" I overheard him ask Linda, who had been nothing but welcoming. She laughed nervously, brushing it off as a joke. Later, I noticed him with Peter, the guy from next door. Peter had been showing off pictures of his kids when Chris leaned in close and said something that made Peter's face drop. Whatever it was, it had clearly hit a nerve. Then Chris found me. I was standing by the drink table, trying to blend in when he appeared at my side. "You must be Sarah," he said, smiling in a way that made my stomach tighten. I nodded, confused. I hadn't introduced myself to him, or anyone else really. "And that's your son Danny, right?" he added, nodding toward where Danny was playing. My heart skipped a beat. How did he know our names? I should have asked him how he knew our names, but the words caught in my throat. His smile lingered for a moment before he walked away, moving on to another group of neighbors as if nothing had happened. The storm started not long after. The sky darkened so fast it felt unnatural, the bright summer sun swallowed by heavy swirling clouds. A gust of wind sent paper plates and decorations flying. Someone shouted, "Storm's coming, everyone inside." Linda waved me over to her house. "Come on, you'll be safe here," she said. Her voice strained as the first raindrops fell. I grabbed Danny and followed her, joining a small group of neighbors huddled in her cozy living room. Chris was there too. Of course he was. He sat by the window, staring out at the sheets of rain, his face calm, almost serene. The storm howled outside, but inside it was eerily quiet. People murmured nervously about the sudden change in weather, glancing toward Chris as if waiting for him to say something. And then he did. "It's funny," he said, his voice breaking the silence like a crack of thunder. "How much people think they know about their neighbors." Everyone froze. Chris's words hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. The nervous hum of conversation stopped, replaced by an uneasy silence. "What are you talking about?" Peter asked, his voice wary. He stood near the door, his arms crossed defensively. Chris leaned back in his chair, his smile growing wider. "I mean, people love their little secrets, the things they think no one else knows. But secrets have a way of slipping out." His gaze drifted to Linda, who sat clutching her mug of tea like it was her only lifeline. "Take you, for example," Chris said. "Linda, how's that new lock on your back door working? Does it keep him out now?" Linda's face went white. Her hands trembled, and she stammered, "I don't... What are you talking about?" Chris chuckled softly. "Oh, come on. You know who I mean." The room erupted into whispers, everyone glancing between Chris and Linda. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I think you should leave," she said, her voice shaking. But Chris didn't move. Instead, he turned his attention to Peter. "And you," he said, "still sneaking off at night? What excuse do you give her now?" Peter's face flushed red, and his wife gasped, staring at him. The room began to unravel. The room was chaos now, voices overlapping, accusations flying. Linda tried to defend herself. Peter stammered something about just needing space, and the rest of the group shifted nervously in their seats. Everyone avoided Chris's eyes. He stood slowly, towering over us, as if the storm outside had given him power. "You're all so desperate to hide the truth," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "But it's already here, isn't it? The lies, the betrayals, and the guilt." Chris paused, letting the silence settle. Then he spoke again, quieter this time, almost a whisper. "Someone here invited me, someone who knew it was time for the truth to come out. But the question is, who?" The lights flickered. For a moment, the room was plunged into darkness. And when they came back on, Chris was gone. The door to the house hung open, rain slashing against the floor. No one moved. No one spoke. Finally, Linda broke the silence. Who is he? What does he want?" No one had an answer. When Danny and I made it home that night, I found a note slipped under my door. Scrawled in neat handwriting, it read, "Be careful what you bury. It always finds its way back." Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Have you ever lived somewhere that felt too quiet, too perfect? Like something was hiding beneath the surface? That's how I used to feel about Violet Street. It was the kind of place where nothing out of the ordinary ever happened. A row of cozy houses, lined with tall maple trees, neighbors who smiled as they passed, and kids playing without a care in the world. I thought it was the safest place anyone could live. But I was wrong. So very wrong. It started with a single letter. Nothing fancy, just a plain white envelope left on my porch. It wasn't addressed to me by name, just resident. At first, I thought it might be junk mail or some neighborhood flyer. But when I opened it, the message was chilling. Nobody visits at that hour, and I hadn't seen anyone approach the house. No explanation, no signature. For a moment, I sat there, hoping it was just my imagination, thinking it had to be some kind of prank. The knocks came again. After all, what could something like that even mean? Violet Street wasn't the kind of place where strange things happened. At least, not until then. I didn't realize it at the time, but that letter was the beginning of everything. What followed would make me question everything I thought I knew about my quiet little neighborhood. And if you stick around until the end of this story, you'll find out the one thing I wish I had done differently, the one thing that could have changed everything. Would you ignore a warning like that? Let's find out. At first, I didn't think much about the letter. It was strange, sure, but life on Violet Street went on as usual. I tossed it into the trash and went about my day. The neighborhood felt the same, calm, predictable, and ordinary. But then, small things started to happen. It was so subtle at first that I didn't even connect the dots. The porch lights along the street began flickering at the same time, almost like they were in sync. It wasn't just my house. It was everyone's. A neighbor joked about the electrical work in the area, but it felt off. Then, pets started to disappear. Cats that had roamed the neighborhood for years suddenly vanished without a trace. Dogs that were always tied up in backyards somehow got loose. People were worried, but nobody could explain it. Then there was the sound. It started late one night, a low, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. I thought it was just some distant machinery or maybe the wind, but it didn't stop. Every night it grew louder, wrapping around the street like a blanket. I couldn't sleep. Something about it made my skin crawl. The final straw came one night when I heard footsteps on my roof. At first, I I thought it was a raccoon or some other animal. I grabbed a flashlight and rushed to the window, but what I saw was impossible. Just for a second, I caught a glimpse of something. Tall, impossibly thin, its shadow stretching against the glow of the streetlight. And then it was gone. The next morning, another letter arrived. This one was shorter, more direct. It will knock 3 times. That's when I realized this wasn't just a prank. Something was happening on Violet Street, and I was at the center of it. I wanted to tell someone about the letters, but every time I tried, the words felt ridiculous. Who would believe me? A shadow on the roof? Letters with cryptic warnings? It sounded like something out of a bad horror movie. So I kept it to myself. I figured if I ignored it, it would go away. But that turned out to be the worst mistake I could have made. 3 nights later, it happened. Just like the letter said. I was sitting in my living room, trying to distract myself with some late-night TV, when I heard it. 3 deliberate knocks on the front door. They were slow, hollow, and uncomfortably loud, as if whoever or whatever was on the other side wanted to make sure I heard them. I froze. It was almost midnight. Three more, perfectly spaced, as if taunting me. Against every ounce of instinct, I got up and went to the door. My hand hovered over the knob, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might burst. Slowly, I turned it and pulled the door open. There was nothing, just the empty street bathed in the pale glow of the streetlights. The air was colder than it should have been, biting at my skin. But on the doormat, there was something new, a dusty, antique key. It looked old, its surface tarnished and worn, but I had no idea what it was for. I picked it up carefully, half expecting something to happen. But the street stayed quiet. For now, I stood there for a long time, staring at the key, feeling like I had just stepped into a trap. Deep down, I knew this wasn't over. The letters, the knocks, the key, it was all building to something. Something I couldn't understand, and something I wasn't sure I wanted to face. After that night, the letters started coming more frequently. Each one was more unsettling than the last. They were always short, always typed, and always delivered without a trace of who sent them. The warnings became darker, more specific. One read, "Do not answer its questions." Another, "Do not look into its eyes." The words rattled me, but I still didn't know what they meant, or what I was even supposed to avoid. I started noticing strange changes in the neighborhood. My once friendly neighbors no longer waved or smiled. Some wouldn't even make eye contact. A few disappeared altogether, their houses sitting dark and empty without any explanation. The eerie hum that had plagued the nights became louder, more insistent, almost like it was alive, pushing into my thoughts. Sleep became impossible and paranoia set in. Then, one night I heard the knock again. But this time, it wasn't coming from the front door. It was coming from inside the house. 3 slow, deliberate knocks, echoing through the stillness. My chest tightened as I sat frozen in my chair. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My mind raced, trying to convince me it wasn't real, that I was imagining things. But deep down, I knew better. The sound came again. Closer this time, as if it was moving toward me. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy book, and crept toward the source of the noise. My hands were shaking, my heart pounding louder than the knocks themselves. When I reached the hallway, it was empty, but the air was heavy, suffocating. I could feel it, whatever it was, watching me. I locked every door and window that night, but it didn't matter. The house didn't feel safe anymore. The letters had warned me, but I had no idea how to stop this. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just in my head. Violet Street had changed, and so had I. And somehow, I knew that the worst was still to come. Morning came. I decided to confront the letters. There had to be something I was missing, some connection that would make sense of it all. I spread them out on my kitchen table, my hands trembling as I reread each one. The warnings were clear, but they didn't tell me how to fight back or what I was even fighting against. The key sat beside them, its tarnished surface catching the dim light. What was it for? Why had it been left for me? As I stared at the letters, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The spacing between the words seemed off, almost deliberate. I rearranged the letters in my mind, trying to decipher a hidden message, but nothing clicked. Frustrated, I shoved them aside and turned to the key. Maybe it held the answer. I inspected it more closely, running my fingers over its worn edges. There were faint markings on its surface, symbols I didn't recognize. They looked ancient, like something from another time, another place. That night, I sat by the door, the key in one hand and a flashlight in the other. I wasn't sure what I was waiting for, but I knew it was coming. The air felt heavier as the hours passed, pressing down on me like a weight. Then, at exactly midnight, the knocks came again. 3 sharp, deliberate taps. Only this time, they didn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent, each one echoing through the house. I clenched the key, my heart racing. The knocks turned into pounding, as if something was trying to force its way in. The warnings from the letters screamed in my mind. Do not let it in. I wanted to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the pounding stopped. The silence was worse. It stretched out, heavy and suffocating, until I heard it, the voice. It was soft, almost a whisper, coming from the other side of the door. "Let me in," it said. "I've been waiting for you." I froze. The voice wasn't human. It was distorted, layered, like multiple people speaking at once. It called my name, slowly, deliberately. I gripped the key tighter, my breath caught in my throat. The warnings played over and over in my head, but I couldn't move. All I could do was wait, hoping, praying that it wouldn't get in. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen, listening to that voice. It kept calling my name, each time slower, more drawn out, like it was savoring the sound. Then it started knocking again, this time from all around the house. The walls, the windows, even the floor. The sound wasn't just knocking anymore. It was like something was scraping, clawing to get in. The key felt heavy in my hand, as if it had a purpose I hadn't yet understood. My mind raced. What if the key wasn't just some random clue? What if it was meant to stop? Whatever this thing was, desperation took over. I ran to the door, gripping the key tightly, and shouted, "What do you want from me?" The knocking stopped. Dead silence filled the house, so thick it felt like I couldn't breathe. Then the voice came again, but this time it was different. It was inside. "You already know," it whispered, its tone mocking. "You let me in long ago." I turned, and there it was. A shadow, impossibly tall and twisted, standing at the end of the hallway. Its eyes weren't eyes at all, but glowing voids that seemed to pull the light from the room. It didn't move, but I could feel it closing in. Every instinct in my body screamed to run, but where? There was no escape from Violet Street, no escape from this thing. I raised the key, unsure of what it would do, but something deep inside told me it was my only chance. The shadow seemed to hesitate, its form flickering, almost as if it feared the key. Gathering what little courage I had left, I lunged forward, thrusting the key toward it. The moment the key touched the air around the shadow, everything changed. A deafening screech filled the house, and the walls began to tremble. The shadow recoiled, writhing as if it was being torn apart. A sudden burst of light erupted from the key, blinding me, and when I opened my eyes, the shadow was gone. The house was silent again. Morning came, and for the first time in weeks, the hum was gone. The air felt lighter, the house brighter. I stepped outside, half expecting the street to look as haunted as it had felt. But Violet Street was normal again. The neighbors were out watering their lawns, waving like nothing had happened. It was as if the nightmare had been erased, leaving no trace except for the key in my hand. I don't know what the key did or why it worked. I don't even know who sent the letters, or why they chose me. But I know one thing. Violet Street will never be the same for me. The hum may be gone, the shadow banished, but I can't shake the feeling that it's not over, that someday it might come back. If you're watching this, remember my story. If you ever receive a letter like the ones I did, don't ignore it, don't dismiss it. Follow the warnings, no matter how strange they seem. And most of all, whatever you do, don't let it in. If this story gave you chills, don't forget to subscribe for more tales like this. Let me know in the comments what you would have done if you were in my place. And if you're brave enough, share this video with a friend. Just be careful who you let watch it. You never know what might follow them home. At first glance, it was a dream come true, a charming neighborhood with picture-perfect homes, well-kept gardens and friendly faces. I thought I'd finally found a safe haven, a place to call home. But then, there was the house, the one at the end of the cul-de-sac. Its windows were perpetually dark, the garden tangled and unkempt, as if time itself had forgotten it. People in the neighborhood rarely spoke about it. When they did, it was always in hushed tones, like they were afraid something or someone might hear them. Rumors flew thick and fast. No one's lived there for years. The owner disappeared decades ago. Some even claimed to have heard whispers late at night, coming from within those lifeless walls, but I shrugged it off, chalking it up to urban legends that every neighborhood seems to have. I wouldn't have believed what I'd heard until I saw it. A shadow, a flicker of movement in the upstairs window. My heart skipped a beat, but I told myself it was just my imagination. After all, who wouldn't feel a little uneasy walking past a house that seemed to breathe its own darkness? But here's the thing. What I saw was just the beginning. What I discovered later about that house and what lives within it changed everything I thought I knew about this quiet little street. Stay with me until the end of this video, and I'll reveal the chilling truth behind the shadow that haunts Maple Street. Trust me, you won't see your neighborhood the same way again. It started small, almost insignificant. A shadow flickering in the upstairs window as I passed by on my evening walks. I'd glance up, and it would be gone. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, I thought. But the unease lingered, that creeping sensation, like someone was watching. The feeling. When your instincts scream that something is off, but you can't quite put your finger on it. The odd occurrences didn't stop there. A week after I moved in, I began noticing the shadow in other places. Always on the edge of my vision, just outside my line of sight. One night, while taking out the trash, I froze. Across the street, beneath the dim glow of a flickering street lamp, I saw it. Not a person, not an animal, just a tall, dark outline standing perfectly still. I blinked, and it was gone. I tried to brush it off as paranoia. Maybe the rumors about the house were getting to me. I told myself I was tired, overworked, and letting my imagination run wild. But the more I ignored it, the bolder the shadow became. Late one evening, I was working at my desk when I felt it again, that heavy, oppressive feeling of being watched. Slowly, I turned to the window. There it was, unmistakable now. A figure, standing in my yard, barely illuminated by the pale moonlight. My breath caught. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen. For what felt like hours, I stared, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. When I finally worked up the courage to move, I closed the blinds and locked every door and window in the house. But the feeling didn't go away. That night, I didn't sleep. And that was the first time I realized, whatever the shadow was, it wasn't confined to that house. It had followed me. After that night, everything changed. It wasn't just the fleeting glimpses of the shadow or the eerie feeling of being watched anymore. It was the dreams. They started a few days later, and they felt so real that I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing like I'd just run a marathon. In the first dream, I was lying in bed, unable to move. My room was bathed in an eerie silver glow from the moonlight streaming through the window. At first, everything seemed normal, till I noticed the corner of my room. A shadowy figure stood there, darker than the surrounding night. Its outline was indistinct, but those eyes, hollow, empty pits that seemed to suck the light out of the air. I wanted to scream, to thrash, to do anything to wake myself up, but my body refused to cooperate. It was as though I was trapped, pinned under the weight of its gaze. The shadow didn't move, didn't come closer. It just stood there, watching, waiting. When I finally woke up, gasping for air, I swore it wasn't just a dream. But then it happened again and again. Each night, the shadow crept closer in my dreams, and each time, I woke up with that same feeling of dread, as if it had left some part of itself behind. I even started noticing small, unexplainable things in my house during the day. A creak in the floorboards when no one was there, doors that seemed slightly ajar when I knew I'd closed them. Then came the worst night of all. I had been trying to stay awake, desperate to avoid another encounter. But exhaustion eventually won. The dream came back, more vivid than ever. This time, the shadow wasn't in the corner. It was standing at the foot of my bed. Its form was clearer now, tall and impossibly thin, like its body was stretched beyond human proportions. I could feel its presence, cold and suffocating, as if the air in the room had been replaced by ice. Its hollow eyes bore into me, and I swear I heard it whisper my name. When I woke up, my room felt colder than usual. I sat up, trembling, and that's when I saw it. On the window pane, just above the condensation from the chilly night air, was a single, muddy handprint. It was too large to be mine, too distinct to ignore. That was when I knew. The shadow wasn't just in my dreams anymore. It was here, in my world, and it wasn't going to leave. The next day, I couldn't bring myself to stay in the house. I packed a bag and drove to a nearby hotel, desperate for some distance, for a break from whatever was happening. But even in the hotel room, the feeling didn't leave me. It was like the shadow had embedded itself in my mind. Every flicker of movement in the corner of my eye made me jump. Every creak in the building sent chills down my spine. That night, I forced myself to stay awake again, but as the hours dragged on, exhaustion took over. My head dipped, and I slipped into an uneasy sleep. When I woke up, the hotel room was silent. Too silent. The air felt thick, oppressive, and I knew before I even looked that it was there. I turned my head slowly toward the window, and my heart dropped. The curtains were open, though I'd shut them before going to bed. Beyond the glass, standing just outside the faint glow of a street lamp, was the shadow. This time, it wasn't just watching. It was closer than ever before, almost pressed against the window pane. Its form was clearer now, its long, bony arms stretched unnaturally, its head tilted in an almost curious way. My body froze as its hand slowly lifted and pressed against the glass. It left a faint, greasy outline before fading back into the darkness. I knew then that running wasn't going to help. Wherever I went, it would follow. And worse, it was getting bolder, Determined to find answers, I returned to Maple Street the next day. I didn't go back to my house. I went straight to the dark house at the end of the cul-de-sac. If this thing came from anywhere, it was there. The air grew colder as I approached, and the overgrown yard seemed almost alive, the grass whispering with each step I took. The front door loomed in front of me, weathered and cracked, as though it hadn't been opened in years. But as I reached for the doorknob, I noticed something chilling. On the wooden frame, carved into the rotting wood, was a message. The letters were jagged and uneven, like they'd been scratched in desperation. At that moment, the front door creaked open slightly, revealing nothing but darkness inside. The house wasn't abandoned after all. Or maybe something far worse had claimed it. I stood there, paralyzed by fear. Behind me, I could feel the air grow heavier, colder. I didn't need to turn around to know. It was there. The shadow had followed me. And now, I was right where it wanted me. I don't know what compelled me to step inside the house. Maybe it was desperation for answers. Or maybe it was something else. Something the shadow wanted. The air was icy as I crossed the threshold, and the darkness inside was suffocating. Like the house had swallowed every last shred of light. The smell hit me first. A damp, earthy odor mixed with something metallic. The floorboards groaned beneath my feet as I moved cautiously, my breath shallow, my hands trembling. Every step felt like a mistake, but I couldn't stop. It was as though the house itself was pulling me deeper. The interior was eerily empty. No furniture, no signs of life, just bare walls, peeling paint, and an oppressive silence that pressed down on me. But then I saw it. A single photograph lying on the floor in the middle of the living room. I picked it up, my hands shaking. The photo was old, its edges frayed and yellowed with time. It showed a group of people standing in front of this very house. Their faces were cheerful, smiling, except for one detail. In the background, standing in the shadow of the porch, was a figure. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The shadow. Even in the photograph, it seemed to radiate malice. It didn't belong in the world of the living. As I stared at the photo, I heard a faint creak behind me. My blood ran cold. Slowly, I turned, and there it was. The shadow wasn't just watching me now, it was inside the house, standing mere feet away. It was larger than before, its outline sharper, its presence more menacing. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room, and a deafening silence replaced it. The shadow began to move, gliding toward me with an unnatural fluidity. I stumbled back, my mind racing for an escape. As I turned to run, the front door slammed shut with a thunderous bang. The house was alive, and it wasn't letting me go. The shadow loomed closer, its hollow eyes locking onto mine. A voice, low and guttural, echoed through the room. It wasn't coming from the shadow, but from the walls, the floors, the very air around me. You've seen too much. You cannot leave. My vision blurred, my body frozen in terror. I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder and everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying on my front lawn, the morning sun warming my skin. I sat up, dazed and disoriented. My house looked exactly as I had left it, and the dark house at the end of the cul-de-sac was silent again, its door tightly shut. But I knew better. Whatever happened in that house wasn't over. The shadow hadn't left, and now I wasn't sure it ever would. Some things are better left unseen, and some houses are better left alone. If you ever feel the gaze of something watching you, don't ignore it. You might not be able to escape it, no matter how far you run. Subscribe and press the bell icon.